Years ago, in the midst of the sex scandal involving then-President Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, World Magazine published an open letter to one of the men who had been selected by President Clinton to be his spiritual advisor in the aftermath of that scandal. I wanted to read you a portion of the letter because it was particularly applicable to our message today. The letter begins, "I'm heartened to know that you are among those who will offer counsel and accountability to the president. I'm praying that God will use you, an evangelical, as an instrument of God's grace in the life of Mr. Clinton. I hope you won't be offended if I'm so bold as to offer a few words of advice. First, remember that the president is a Southerner. There are something interesting things you should know about those of us who are Southerners. One is that many of us suffer from the Elvis syndrome, by which I mean the ability to stand around the piano at Graceland and sing gospel songs with tears in our eyes, then go upstairs to fornicate and persuade ourselves in the morning that the real person is the hymn-singing person. We have to confront the truth that the real person is not the sentimental one, but the sinful one. The other thing to note about us is that we grew up in a culture that holds a peculiar perversion of the fifth point of Calvinism. The doctrine that God preserves his people so that they persevere in faith became once saved, always saved, which in turn became once you've walked the aisle, you're saved no matter what. This gives a false security that we can live like hell and still go to heaven. Second piece of advice, teach the president that while forgiveness is free, grace is expensive. In the present moral crisis, we evangelicals must remain evangelical. And that means refusing the Jewish idea that we can atone for our sins and the Roman Catholic idea that we can make up for our sins through acts of penance. Forgiveness is free, granted immediately and completely to those who confess their sins and claim Christ. But the grace that provides that forgiveness has an infinite cost, the humiliation and death of the Son of God. Now let's turn the spotlight away from the former president and shine it on ourselves for just a moment. What evidence in your life is there that you are truly saved? I'm afraid too many Christians today suffer from the Elvis syndrome. They think that because they have their so-called ticket to heaven, they can live any way they choose to live. They can gather together on Sundays and sing hymns and feel exhilarated and have tears in their eyes, but go out and live like the devil the rest of the week without any consequence whatsoever. They cling to the doctrine, once saved, always saved, putting the emphasis on the wrong phrase. You see, even more important than the phrase always saved is the phrase once saved. The only people who can have assurance of salvation are those who have been truly saved. The security of the believer only applies to those who are truly believers. And let me be very clear about this. While the basis of our salvation is always grace, the evidence of our salvation is our obedience to God. And you can't separate one from the other. We see that truth illustrated in the passage we're going to look at today in Genesis chapters 45 through 46, as we look at the very real change that occurred both in Joseph's brothers and even Joseph's father Jacob when they received the gift of forgiveness they desperately needed. Remember where we were in the story? Last time we saw the dramatic account of where Joseph actually revealed his identity to his brothers. They thought they had been dealing with just the prime minister of Egypt. It was their own brother Joseph whom they had sold into slavery. And we saw how Joseph evidences true forgiveness. True forgiveness resists unnecessary embarrassment. Joseph tried to deal with his brothers as privately as possible. It relieves the offender of unhealthy grief. Joseph said to his brothers, don't be angry with yourselves. And then true forgiveness releases the offender of their obligation. Instead of giving his brothers what they deserved, death, he gave them what they needed, a new place in which to live. And finally, true forgiveness refocuses everyone's attention on the sovereignty of God. Remember what his brothers would say to Joseph? Or Joseph would say to his brothers, Joseph said, and as for you, you meant evil against me. What you did was wrong, but God is bigger than you are. God used it for good to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. And so after that great revelation of his identity, the story continues in verse 16 of chapter 45 as we look at the change that occurred in both Joseph's brothers and his fathers. First of all, let's look at the brothers. They evidenced a change in attitude after they were forgiven. Look at verse 16. And when the news was heard in Pharaoh's house that Joseph's brothers had come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. Now, Joseph had tried to deal as privately as he could with his brothers. He had everybody else leave the room. But once this happened, once Joseph revealed himself, word spread through the Egyptian grapevine. Everybody knew about what had happened there. Now, it hadn't been any mystery that Joseph was a slave. Everybody knew that. He had been bought out of slavery. But they didn't know the whole story. I'm sure there's some people who question Pharaoh's wisdom in putting a former slave in charge of all of Egypt. And yet, once the whole story was known and the fact that the brothers had asked forgiveness and there had been a reconciliation, it vindicated Pharaoh's choice. And Pharaoh wanted to reward his servant Joseph for preserving the nation during the time of famine. So Pharaoh gives this order beginning in verse 17. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, say to your brothers, do this, load your beast and go back to the land of Canaan. And take your father and your households and come to me. And I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat of the land. Now you are ordered, do this, take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. But don't concern yourselves with your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. You see what he's doing? He doesn't know he's accomplishing God's will. He doesn't even believe in God probably, but Pharaoh's accomplishing God's purpose. He said, I want you, Joseph, to tell your brothers to go back with empty wagons from Egypt and load up all the junk and move it back to the land of Egypt. Now remember, the Egyptians are the ones who invented the wheel. They're the ones who invented the wagons. It's like Pharaoh is sending the moving vans to go ahead and pick up this fledgling nucleus of the nation of Israel, about 70 people total, the brothers, their wives, their children and grandchildren, and move them to Egypt. Now, actually, he gave orders to move the family and don't take any of the junk or the stuff. But as we'll see in a moment,